So here are some interesting rules that were common courtesy from the Victorian time period, just to give you a feel for what this time period was like. The Victorian era began in 1832, around the time when Queen Victoria took the throne of England, and it ended in 1901 with her death. And after that, we just call it the modern period. So Queen Victoria inherited the throne at 18 after her father's brothers all died without an heir, and she didn't really have much actual power. She was mostly a figurehead, but she really tried to influence her government. She became a national icon and was a symbol of personal morality and prudishness, and she was just a really proper woman. And she married her first cousin Albert in 1840, and they had 9 kids and 34 grandkids. And after he died in 1861, she went into mourning and was rarely seen in public. But amazingly enough, she reigned for 63 years and 7 months, which made her the longest British monarch and the longest reigning female in history, which is kind of amazing. So in general, during this time, in both Britain and the United States, London, it was a big time of change. So London became the most important city in Europe. The population expanded. There was a shift of the ownership of land to a modern urban economy. And basically what that means is that the families that had owned the land in the countryside for generations were losing their land because it was needed for urbanization, it was needed for industrialism and things like that. And so that was one of the impacts of industrialism, is this kind of shifting in who owned land and who could actually make money. And so people who could work in factories and had jobs started to become wealthy. And so it began to break down these social constructs that have been in place in Britain for so many years. And so England became the world's foremost imperial power. And, during this time, Victorian people suffered from a lot of anxiety, and they had a sense of being displaced in an age of technological advances. So again, this is a time of great change, quick change, and it was because of industrialism. And this is just a quick little chart to show you who was in each class, what type of person. And so you can glance at that. And according to Lauren Goodland from this source that's on the page, the Victorian emphasis upon the gentleman served as a means of retaining upper class political power and keeping down the middle class. And so that's why there were so many rules about what makes a gentleman and what makes a lady. And it was a means to maintain these social constructs that were apparent for so long in this society. Meanwhile, in America, the Industrial Revolution was still in flux. People were working long hours in horrible conditions. Again, the middle class was rising up because these people could make money. And so there's this middle class that the government didn't know what to do with. And products were made better and more efficiently because of industrialism. The early segment of this time period was really important. There was an economic depression followed by high unemployment, and child labor was still an issue in both England and America. And in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, London's air became extremely polluted, and that changed the landscape of the country ever since. And so this slide basically shows you a timeline of the railway system being built, which was huge. It was huge for industrialism. It was huge for immigration and people moving from the country to the city. And so the train transformed England's landscape and supported the growth of commerce and shrank the distance between cities. It was a huge deal. And things started to change when Victoria took the throne. There were many improvements in social conditions, including this Reform Bill of 1832, which extended the right to vote to all males that owned property. And also some child labor laws were passed to protect younger children from working in harsh conditions. Education was being state mandated for those who were under 12 years old, which had huge ramifications because that helped Britain and America become more literate countries because children are actually being schooled. So again, during this time of the early Victorian era in the 1830s and 40s, there was high unemployment, poverty, rioting, slums in large cities, and children and women worked in these terrible conditions. And so during this time period, child labor was a hot topic because before children played an important part of agricultural life. They'd always helped out on the farm, in which 14-hour days weren't uncommon. So when they started working in factories, it just continued. They just worked that many hours there. And since mechanization often created conditions of labor in which adult male strength and skill lost much of its importance, children who were paid much less than adult males became widely employable. That's why there were so many in factories. So these young kids who had, who were really small and agile, they made better qualified employees than adult men and women. And so, for example, in this textile mill in Rhode Island, one of the first textile mills in America, it employed young boys, and they were to dart between these rapidly moving machinery to fix these broken threads while the machines worked at top speed. And it often caused children to have these terrible accidents and lose their arms and legs and hands and things like that. So that's kind of what was going on for the kids during this time. And so all these issues were being shared with literature. And so some of the novelists on here were responding to those things that were happening. And during the mid-Victorian period, we saw a lot of these reforms make some difference. And so it became a better time for people, especially in England. It was a time of prosperity, improvement, stability, and optimism. And one example of this is the Crystal Palace, which was erected in London, 1851. And it was built to exhibit modern industry and science. And it basically symbolized the triumphs of Victorian industry. So it's kind of cool monument to that. During this time, imperialism and colonialism continued to expand Britain as a ruling power across the world. So Queen Victoria eventually became the Empress of India, and many British people saw this expansion, this colonialism, as a moral issue. They did it in the name of Christianity, and it also colonization allowed the British rule to expand, and it also grew the British economy. So it had these big ramifications as well. And in the religious sector, there were a lot of movements happening between different groups of people and the church. And so the high church had been in place to be the state church, and it emphasized the importance of tradition, ritual, and authority. It was just the church that everyone went to in England. But the Oxford movement began, and these members, it was called the Oxford movement because the members that were associated with it were associated with the University of Oxford, okay? And they argued for the reinstatement of the lost Christian traditions of the faith and wanted to include them into the Anglican theology. So they've been missing for some time. And these people conceived that the Anglican Church was one of the three branches of the Catholic Church, okay? So that was kind of one little thing that was going on in the religious sector during this time. And when talking about philosophy, utilitarianism should come to mind. And the basic idea of utilitarianism is the greatest happiness principle that basically states actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And so basically happiness equals pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness equals pain, the absence of pleasure. And so according to these utilitarianists such as Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. And so these English philosophers were the leading proponents of what we now call classic utilitarianism. They were social reformers. They supported things like suffrage for women and for those without property. So that means giving them the vote. And they supported the abolition of slavery. Utilitarians argued that criminals ought to be reformed and not merely punished. And Bentham spoke out against cruelty to animals. And so these proponents emphasized that utilitarianism was an egalitarian doctrine, which makes sense because they supported everyone being able to vote and the ending of slavery, okay? So everyone's happiness counts equally. So then we get to the late Victorian period. There was a decay of Victorian values, British imperialism, of course, and the Boer War, which are called the Freedom Wars, that were fought toward the end of the Victorian era, and it was against the British Empire and the Dutch settlers in South Africa. Okay, so it's sometimes called the South African War because a lot of the black South Africans were involved in the war as well. And then there was the Irish question, which we still see the ramifications of this question today. So it basically asks who really rules Ireland. Okay, this question became very dominant toward the end of the Victorian period. And so Ireland had been integrated into Britain since 1801, but toward the end of this period, the Irish people wanted independence, and there were uprisings, and this eventually caused the separation between Northern Ireland, which we now call the UK, and mainland Ireland. And during the end of the Victorian period, the Catholics supported the union, but Protestant Unionists resisted the idea of the two being joined. And so that tension still exists today. Germany became a rival power, as it did the United States. And still there was economic depression, and it led to mass immigration. So people were moving, and socialism was on the rise. So there was this mood of melancholy during the 1890s, and the aesthetic movement began. And aestheticism is the belief that art is for art's sake. Okay, we don't need a reason to have art. And this is also the beginning of the modern movement in literature. So the issues of women's rights, suffrage, reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, property rights, legal rights, and medical rights, marriage, dominated the cultural discussions in newspapers and intellectual circles. And during the latter half of this era, social reforms were beginning to permeate into this once sacred realm of womanhood, which we're about to talk about. And so that's what we mean when we talk about the women question, is the Industrial Revolution was changing the culture and changing the way that women were seen and what they were able to do. And so you'll see here there were a few acts that were passed in the wake of these questions. And education for women, I mean, it just took off. The first women's college was established in 1848, and by the end of Victoria's reign, women could take degrees at 12 university colleges. So bad working conditions and underemployment drove thousands of women into prostitution. And if you were unmarried and you're middle class, the best way that you could earn a living was to become a governess, which you will read about in a lot of the Victorian novels. And so Victorian women were a fascinating topic to society, and they were seen as, these domestic women who were enshrined within her home, and her role was to create a place of peace where men could take refuge from the difficulties of modern life. So women in the home, they always go hand in hand in the Victorian era. And we'll pick up with this in the next video.